President Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected in the 1952 United States presidential election and had previously been the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II and was considered to be the most apolitical candidate since George Washington. Ike entered office at the height of the Cold War and also did a lot to help America's domestic situation. But that's not what this video is about, as we are only looking at foreign policy here. He followed the New Look policy, which saw balancing the Cold War military commitments of the United States with the nation's financial resources. The policy emphasized reliance on strategic nuclear weapons as well as reorganizing the conventional forces in an effort to deter potential threats, both conventional and nuclear, from Eastern Bloc nations headed by the Soviet Union. The Bricker Amendment was also defeated in Congress, which now allowed the president to make executive agreements with other nations without having to consult Congress because those congressional idiots really didn't fully understand foreign policy. The first thing on the foreign policy front that President Eisenhower did was end the Korean War, which had plagued the world for 3 years. Ike got the ceasefire, and Korea remains divided to this day as of 2024. Eisenhower then provided U.S. aid to South Korea to help rebuild the country after the 3-year-long destructive war. Impacts of this aspect of Ike's foreign policy on Korea are pretty easy to see in 2024, as North and South Korea are divided, where the South is epic, capitalist, and happy, while North Korea is pretty communist, starving, depressing, and ruled by a fat boy dynasty, and also sees a lot of their population want to escape to the South. In Europe, Eisenhower believed in maintaining a strong defense for deterring the Soviets from expanding westward. In 1953, many East Germans rose up in rebellion because communism sucks and the Soviets were brutally suppressing the uprising. A similar but much larger uprising took place in Hungary in 1956. The United States strongly condemned the military response, and Eisenhower sent an appeal to Nikolai Bulganin calling on the withdrawal of Soviet forces. Eisenhower had desperately wanted to help the Hungarians because they wanted democracy in their country and their current Stalinist government sucked. But he knew that sending American troops would trigger a war with the Soviets, and this perceived mild move disappointed many Hungarian revolutionaries, but Ike avoided starting World War III here. Also in Europe, the U-2 spy plane incident occurred where in May of 1960 an American U-2 spy plane had been shot down over the Soviet Union, and the pilot, Francis Scary Powers, was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment and 7 years of hard labor. And this was in the Soviet Union, mind you, so things were going to be terrible for the guy. Anyway, Ike's administration decided to first play dumb and claim that the U-2 was a weather balloon. Now, things could have gone really bad as the Soviets had the plane and the pilot, but you see, Khrushchev constantly made a fool of himself on the world stage, and that didn't really matter all that much in the long run. But the impacts were that the Soviets backed out of the 1960 Paris Peace Summit, which originally saw hope for de-escalating the Cold War, as previously Khrushchev and Ike had got along well at Camp David the year before. The U.S. developed better spy planes, and Powers got back to the United States in a 1962 prisoner exchange. Moving to Southeast Asia and Indochina, France was losing the Indochina War, and Eisenhower didn't want to get the U.S. involved in another war just as Korea was ending. He believed in the domino theory and sent some support to France, but the war ended in 1954 with the Viet Minh victory. The administration did not approve of the partition of Vietnam at the 1954 Geneva Conference and directed economic and military aid and advice to South Vietnam. Eisenhower's commitment to South Vietnam was part of a broader program to contain China and the Soviet Union in the East. In 1954, the United States and 7 other countries created the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, which was basically a NATO of Asia, and it was a defensive alliance dedicated to preventing the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia. SEATO would prove useful as it ended 2 crises with China over Taiwan, as the communist Chinese tried to bully everyone into letting them take Taiwan. But you see, Eisenhower was just built different and responded with some sweet gunboat diplomacy and spoke softly with a big stick Theodore Roosevelt style, which saw China backing down. The first one came in 1954 when China started shelling Taiwan, and Eisenhower had a strong response where he casually reminded the Chinese that the US had nukes, as well as said not to escalate things, and China withdrew and stayed mad. The second one came in 1958 and started and ended in pretty similar fashion. After the 1954 crisis, the United States and Taiwan signed the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, which committed the United States to the defense of Taiwan. China would continue to try to get Taiwan with several other Taiwan Strait crises throughout the 20th century, but Eisenhower's policy of deterrence has worked every time against China and Taiwan, as Taiwan remains pretty free, rich, and happy as of 2024. And every U.S. president has followed the same strategy as Eisenhower regarding Taiwan every time China feels like trolling the rest of Asia. Turning to South Asia, the U.S. had a pretty good relationship with Pakistan when Ike entered office, and this made India move more towards the Soviets. Therefore, Eisenhower did the logical thing and started to build good relations with India. Apparently, things went over pretty well, and so well that India decided to go full-on neutral instead of pro-Soviet. But you see, although India and the Soviets had kind of a good relationship despite their neutrality, the Indians and Chinese had pretty bad relations because, China has a border dispute with pretty much all of its neighbors. But back to India-Pakistan, the U.S. would end up becoming a mediator in the India-Pakistan conflict throughout the Cold War, as the U.S. was pretty friendly with both. Moving to the Middle East, the Suez Crisis came in 1956, where Britain, France, and Israel had invaded Egypt, and Ike wasn't having any of it. He told them all to back down before Egypt completely collapsed, and the Soviets also threatened to drop a nuke in the area to end the war. This was one of the only times that the US and Soviets were actually on the same side, and as a result, Gamal Abdel Nasser toned down his anti-American ideas in Egypt as he got along pretty well with American officers. Also, the crisis showed that America was in charge and Britain and France couldn't just do whatever they wanted because the US wouldn't tolerate it. In response to the power vacuum in the Middle East, following the Suez Crisis, the Eisenhower administration developed a new policy designed to stabilize the region against Soviet threats and internal turmoil. Given the collapse of the British prestige in the region and the rise of Soviet interests, the President informed Congress in 1957 that it was essential for the U.S. to accept new responsibilities for the security of the Middle East. Under the policy known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, any Middle Eastern country could request American economic assistance or military aid if it was being threatened by armed aggression. The U.S. would support Jordan, and the aid played a big role in ending a revolution. The doctrine was then applied militarily during the Lebanon crisis of 1958, where the presence of U.S. Marines and soldiers in the country as a result of Operation Bluebat. The revolution in Lebanon was halted and democracy in the country was resumed. Bluebat marks the only time that U.S. troops were sent into a potential conflict zone during the Eisenhower administration, as he was just that good at diplomacy and deterrence, so much so that nobody wanted to try to start a war against the U.S. because Ike was credible. In Iraq, however, King Faisal was brutally overthrown in the 1958 Iraqi Revolution, and the country came under the rule of Brigadier General Qasim, who moved the country from being a U.S. ally to favoring the Soviets. But his reign wouldn't last too long, as Iraq's population was more politically divided in the 1960s than America's population in the 2020s, and a large series of coups occurred. Eisenhower just kind of stayed out of the conflict as a whole and advised all future presidents, being Kennedy and Johnson, to do the same because he didn't want America to enter that minefield. In 1953, the CIA's first ever coup would occur in Iran, where the British came whining to America that Iran was nationalizing their oil, and Eisenhower didn't care. Then the British came back crying again and said that the Iranians were communists, and the CIA perceived the situation as being very unstable, and a coup to put back the Shah in power was undertaken. Ike's administration also did a little trolling in 1954 with a coup in Guatemala. For much of his administration, Eisenhower largely continued the policy of his predecessors in Latin America, which was supporting U.S.-friendly governments regardless of regime type as long as they weren't communist. The Eisenhower administration expanded military aid to Latin America and used Pan-Americanism as a tool to prevent the spread of Soviet influence. In the late 1950s, several Latin American governments went communist and U.S. aid ended, partially due to a recession in the United States. In Cuba, the Eisenhower administration cut off aid for dictator Fulgencio Batista and supported the Second National Front of Escambray and the Directorio Revolucionario in the Cuban Revolution. He was pretty chill with Castro initially in the late 50s, as Castro wasn't openly any ideology yet. He was just associated with communists such as Che Guevara because, revolution. In January of 1959, however, Castro legalized the Communist Party, and Eisenhower didn't really like this, so in April, when Castro came to the U.S., Eisenhower had Nixon meet Castro, as he didn't want to meet with Castro, and he also feared that Castro was going to go full-on Soviet. So Nixon and Castro had a nice chat. But despite this, overall things were pretty good until Castro declared the country to be communist and kicked out U.S. sugar interests, and it became full gamer time for the Eisenhower administration. Ike's administration would make the plan for the Bay of Pigs invasion to overthrow Castro and the commie regime in Cuba. However, the invasion was set to occur after Eisenhower would leave office, and it was on President Kennedy to carry it out. And the Bay of Pigs invasion wouldn't go well, as Kennedy withdrew much support for it, and the U.S. decided not to intervene in Cuba again, and instead just to opt for clandestine actions to try to remove Castro, as many anti-communist Cubans were extremely devoted to the CIA and anti-Castro activities. Also, during Eisenhower's presidency, the Cold War arms race shifted from nuclear weapons to delivery systems, with the U.S. starting with large leads with very long-ranged aircraft bombers. Eisenhower was aware of the American advantage in ICBM development because intelligence gathered by U-2 planes, which had begun flying over the Soviet Union in 1956, showed that the Soviets were quite behind on this. Eisenhower would also speak out against the military-industrial congressional complex, where Ike knew that the U.S. was well defended, but members of Congress got cash in exchange for unnecessary targeted defense spending. Aside from the Bay of Pigs, the impacts of Eisenhower's foreign policy had a profound effect on the JFK administration. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, former President Eisenhower was a special consultant to President Kennedy. Additionally, the two had previously discussed that the Soviets would respond in Cuba as a result of the failed Bay of Pigs. Ike believed that Khrushchev would do something that he would not ordinarily have done and be perceived as irrational. Therefore, Eisenhower constantly consulted with Kennedy about the Cuban Missile Crisis to help prevent World War III from happening. Eisenhower also consulted Kennedy on the Berlin Wall and other issues that were going on in East Germany. Major impacts on the Nixon administration are pretty clear, as Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president. Nixon had taken a leading role in foreign policy actions under Eisenhower and had helped shore up his understanding of foreign affairs. I'll be doing a separate video on both Kennedy and Nixon's foreign policies in the future, so stay tuned for that. What did you think of Ike's foreign policy? He had many successes and some failures. He saved the world and avoided World War III several times. Certainly a lot of activities are done with incomplete information and are all conducted without hindsight. Next week I'll cover Truman's foreign policy, which I probably should have started with. So if you like this content, maybe I'll see you then, and thank you for watching.